For more on the jobs report from July, we're joined from Weston, Connecticut with Peter Schiff. He's the CEO and Chief Global Strategist at Euro Pacific Capital, and also Mark Hamrick. He's here in the studio with me. He's the Washington Bureau Chief at Bankrate.com. Thank you very much, gentlemen, both for being here on BizAsia America. Mark, let me start with you. 162,000 jobs created. It was a little bit lower than expectations, but the unemployment rate did dip down to 7.4%. How should we read this?
It is a report which was clearly disappointing, but it certainly wasn't a disaster either. We've been sort of conditioned to these reports where job growth has been modest. The Federal Reserve described the economy's growth as modest just this week. This was another report telling us about modest jobs growth.
So we got a modest job growth. Peter, by the way, good to see you again. Let me ask you this. The work week shrank and hourly earnings fell for the first time. Explain to us what that means. I mean, it sounds like bad news, is it?
Well, it is bad news. One of the reasons that the report is actually worse than the headline is because about 2/3 of the jobs that we created are part-time, low-paying service sector jobs. That's the problem. In fact, so far in 2013, I think better than 3/4 of the jobs we created are temporary or part-time, low-paying service sector jobs. We need to create real productive jobs, but unfortunately, we are not doing that in this economy. In fact, I think the labor force is shrinking because the U.S. economy is actually shrinking. I think the GDP numbers we got a couple of days ago are ultimately going to be revised down close to zero. And if we had a more accurate measure of inflation, we would see that we are currently in a recession in the United States, and it's going to get worse. And so, unfortunately, the Fed's not going to taper. They are going to increase the size of QE. And I don't think I'm being a pessimist. I think I'm just being a realist, because I think the reality is it's pretty bleak in the U.S. economy.
Mark, retailers added 46,000 jobs. It confirms what Peter is talking about, that yes, a lot of these new jobs are being created in the sort of lower wage service sector jobs. But isn't that better than no jobs at all?
Well, sure. Traditionally, however, retail, leisure, and hospitality are not the jobs that you write home to tell your parents that you landed, right? So we'd like to see, exactly as Peter says, we'd like to see more business and professional jobs. We'd like to see more full-time jobs. There has been a constant criticism lately that too many of these jobs are part-time. It's also worth mentioning, it's not unusual to have a large pickup in part-time employment before you have full-time jobs being added, and we need to wait and see what happens with that.
Gentlemen, I don't want to compare ourselves to Europe, but in Europe they talk about the youth unemployment. They talk a lot about those who are working part-time jobs, but they really want full-time jobs. And here in the U.S., we obviously have a different case, but there is something that is similar, and that is if the workforce is shrinking and people who want to work aren't working, why is that? I mean, it's hard for a lot of people to understand how that can be, Peter.
Well, first of all, the government makes it very lucrative for a substantial part of the population not to work. If you see the disability, the food stamps use, these things are surging. So a lot of people are living off the government. But also part of the problem is we have a lot of, we have the minimum wage law, we have all sorts of other taxes and regulations that increase the cost of hiring lower skilled people, and that disproportionately hurts the young. And of course, a lot of our young people now who are graduating with these kind of worthless liberal arts degrees with a pile of debt, another reason they don't want to work is they don't want to have to start paying back their student loans.
All right, I want to be very careful here because there are people with me
so it's a lot
who are
easier
probably
just
in
to
my
live
ear
with their parents.
with liberal arts degrees, Peter. But I want to ask you this, talk about the minimum wage increase. There's been a lot of discussion about it locally in different cities. Ultimately, is an increase in minimum wage, is that good or bad for job creation?
Well, it's horrible. I mean, they should abolish the minimum wage. Singapore doesn't have a minimum wage at all, and they hardly have any unemployment. What happens when you have a minimum wage is that you make it illegal for lower skilled people to work, and because they can't get their first job, they can't climb their way up the job ladder to get their second and their third job. And so the higher you make the minimum wage, the more people you permanently trap in unemployment and poverty.
All right, Peter, let me bring Mark back into this picture. You're a veteran here in Washington. Congress is getting ready for their vacation, and let's be honest, they haven't probably done as much as a lot of people had hoped. And a big part of it is the stimulus and the job creation and stimulating local governments. Peter brings up a good point. It's fine that you get people into the workforce, but if they're not moving up the rank of ladder, they're not getting promoted, what does that tell you about the economy? Is it the people? Is it the company? Is it the government? Who's to blame?
Well, I'd just like to back up from this a little bit, and I appreciate the fact that Peter would like to have a society with no laws, but we're coming out of the worst
I didn't say
financial
no laws, just
crisis
no
since
minimum
the
wage
Great
laws.
Depression. It is not a huge surprise that the economy should take a long time to recover from that. It is a time when many people are experiencing a feeling of impatience, and that is a natural human reaction. I think that the economy is doing as well as it is at this point, given what was experienced when we were truly on the precipice, is in some ways a miracle. So Americans are frustrated. I think employers would like to see demand at a level where they could add more jobs, but this is going to be a long recovery, and Chairman Bernanke at the Fed has said that'll be the case. We don't know how long QE will continue, and obviously that's a moving target right now, but don't look to Washington in terms of Congress or the administration to come up with a viable solution anytime soon.
All right, I'm going to let Peter have the last word. And Peter, I want to ask you, this is something that's near and dear to you, this job creation issue. Let me ask you, what can the government do to create jobs, especially from a small business perspective?
Get out of the way. You know, I run many small businesses. I employ over 150 people, and the biggest barrier to job creation for me and for a lot of my clients who are entrepreneurs and run businesses is the government itself. It's the complexity and the cost of the rules and the regulations and the litigation that is coming at them from government. And, you know, by the way, it's not going to be a long recovery. There is no recovery. It's going to be a long depression. You know, during the depression of the 1930s, there were plenty of years where they did have a positive GDP or quarters, but I think the government didn't solve our problems. Everything they did made the problems worse, but simply postponed the day of reckoning. So unfortunately, we're going to have a bigger crisis than one we had in 2008. And it's not a miracle at all. Unfortunately, it's something that was made by man, made by politicians and central bankers, and we're going to have to deal with it. And the only way we will is with free market capitalism, not a centrally planned and manipulated economy like the one we have now in the United States.
All right, Peter, one of these days, we're going to find some data to make you really, really smart. But I do want to thank you for your time joining us from Connecticut. Peter Schiff, CEO of Euro Pacific Capital Group, and also Mark Hamrick here in the studio, Washington Bureau Chief for Bankrate.com. Gentlemen, have a great weekend.